That's all right. Thanks, LJ. So as members of Knowledge Enterprise at ASU, we are pleased to be sharing some of our experience today. Let us introduce ourselves and note again that this presentation will be available through funding.asu.edu.
So hi again, everyone. My name is Amber Martin, and I'm a grant and contract specialist in Knowledge Enterprise. I'm a part of the pre-award proposal negotiation team, but more specifically, the proposal functional group. I work in the Central Research Office, assisting research administrators with navigating federal sponsor and institutional guidelines, reviewing budgets and administrative items and proposals, and submitting proposals.
My name is Sarah Gates. I'm a Research Advancement Administrator Senior in Knowledge Enterprise. I am part of the Research Advancement Services team in Research Operations, and I work with the faculty to prepare and submit competitive proposals, for funding. My team also acts as the central resource to the research administrators across the university. So the following presentation is representative of these different roles that Amber and I have in the proposal process. As the RA, I assist with the proposal preparation and the budget construction. And then Amber, as the grant officer, ensures that the proposals are complete and compliant with all applicable policies prior to submission. This workshop is part of a research development year-long series that addresses the stages of proposal preparation for various sponsors. If you would like notifications on future opportunities, please visit funding.asu.edu and click on the weekly notification request button. This will send an email to your inbox every Friday with all the updated information from the site. And then also please consider visiting Research Academy for upcoming events and training modules. They have some that are geared towards proposal development.
So ASU has a large network of research administrators and a skilled central proposal negotiation team to ensure a proposal is as responsive and viable as it could be for funding. The research admin site can provide insight to the tools used to ensure proposal success, as well as sponsored project policies, some of which that we will discuss later in this presentation.
Ultimately, you're going to want to engage your research administration early and often. They will be your most immediate resource for proposal budget information and will work directly with the proposal and negotiation team for a strong and timely submission. The developed proposal portion of the grant cycle in particular benefits from close work with your pre-award RA. Each unit will have a resource for this assistance. So if you're unsure who to work with, please reach out to your business operations manager.
Today, we'll be covering federal proposal budgets and also giving an overview of the items to consider while constructing your budget. This includes institutional, sponsor, and federal policies, direct and indirect costs, and direct cost categories.
We'll also provide an overview of the budget and budget justification, complex budgets, and additional cost categories to take into consideration. We will have an opportunity, as LJ said, to field questions towards the middle and the end of the presentation, and we'll conclude with additional resources on the presented information. So nearly every federal proposal requires a detailed budget and budget justification. This is your opportunity to tell your potential sponsor what tools, technology, or people your research will require.
In summary, the budget informs the sponsor that the proposed approach has been thought through and is cost effective. It's important to give the sponsor accurate information and to follow all regulations that apply. It's important to note that we are focusing today on federal grant and cooperative agreements, which we also refer to as assistance awards, rather than contracts or acquisitions. Uniform Guidance, which is Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, establishes requirements that grantees must follow when expending funds needed to carry out a federal grant or subgrant. This is different than the Federal Acquisition Regulation, also referred to as the FAR, which establishes rules and requirements that federal agencies must follow in procuring goods and services. So the awards resulting from a grant proposal for a federal funding are policed by the requirements set out in Uniform Guidance, and the sponsors publish policies rather than the FAR.
We'll be referencing Uniform Guidance a few more times in the presentation, but as an applicant for federal funding, You'll just want to understand ASU's obligation to meet program objectives under the prescribed terms and conditions, as well as having substantial management practices in place for administering awards, which includes employing suitable accounting practices and strong internal controls.
So ASU follows 4 cost principles. Under uniform guidance and sponsor regulations, the cost must be allocable, reasonable, and consistent. So for example, costs treated in the same manner under like circumstances. These principles can broadly be used to determine whether the proposed costs are appropriate for the project. And so while you work to identify the cost to conduct the proposed project, it's also important that you recognize applicable policies, which will include policies that are imposed by the sponsor as well as policies imposed by ASU. So to protect institutional eligibility for external funding, ASU must comply with all programmatic, regulatory, fiscal, and property stewardship policies from the federal level down to those that are specific to ASU. Please note that ASU will follow the most restrictive policy. And while federal policies may be found in uniform guidance, sponsor policies may be found in the form of a funding announcement calling for specific proposals or general guide. For example, the National Science Foundation, also referred to as NSF, has a proposal and award policies procedures guide, which we refer to as PAPPG for short. Similarly, the National Institutes of Health has the SF 424 research and related application guide. And it's the source for proposal preparation instructions for NIH grant applications, while NIH also releases funding opportunity announcements for specific programs. NSF and NIH are both considered high proposal volume sponsors for the university.
Your RA and grant officer are well-versed in the common sponsor policies and will help summarize and interpret critical requirements for you to aid in the proposal preparation. So how do these policies impact the budget? We'll begin by broadly identifying the budget in 2 categories, direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs are specifically assigned to the project. They include personnel salary and associated employee benefits, travel, scientific supplies, consultant pay, etc. While indirect costs, more commonly known as facilities and administrative or F&A costs, are incurred by ASU in support of sponsored projects but cannot be identifiable with a single project.
So though F&A costs are general in nature and are shared by multiple users, where it's not easy to determine each user's share, it really can't be overstated that these are real costs. Indirect costs are requested to cover some of the real costs associated with doing research and maintaining the buildings needed to conduct said research. These costs may include most administrative and clerical salaries, most office supplies, basic telephone services, routine postage, utilities, maintenance, and library use, all of which would be considered indirect costs.
And this graphic illustrates the tangible application of direct costs and F&A and is intended to convey just how critical these costs are in conducting research. F&A can be a considerable portion of the proposed budget. We'll discuss ASU's federally approved F&A rate in just a moment, but for a general idea, most universities charge between 50 to 60% for organized research. Depending on the type of project and the cost it contains, this can result in over 1/3 of your total project budget. It is worth mentioning, though, that there are occasions where items that would otherwise be regarded as facilities and administrative are direct charge to the grant. These are called CAS exceptions, and they're derived from the cost accounting standards that apply to educational institutions under uniform guidance. They are in place to ensure consistency in cost accounting, and specifically that each type of cost is allocated only once to the federal award. But for instance, if your project has substantial amount of postal mail that's critical to the project, and the cost of the stamps that you need can ultimately be shown as dedicated exclusively to the project, then you may be granted an exception to direct charge these costs to the project.
ASU's policy is to request and recover full F&A cost. The F&A rate varies according to the type of project. So whether it's research, instruction, or an other category like public service, and a project's performance site, and that's whether or not it's on or off campus. The on-campus versus off-campus determination is usually based on personnel effort. On the next slide, we'll also see a table that shows how our federally negotiated rates differ based on type and performance site. So the federal government determines the F&A rates in conjunction with ASU using uniform guidance. The rates are reviewed and approved every 5 years. ASU's most current F&A rate agreement, the first page of which is the screenshots of the left of the slide, or on the left side of the slide, continues in effect until new rates are finalized. In certain instances, the rate may be limited by the sponsor per published policy, which would it could be either like outlined in the funding announcement or on the sponsor's website or in other written and published sponsor guidelines. In the case of a sponsor having a published policy where they instruct the applicant to use a certain F&A rate, your proposal budget will incorporate that rate rather than ASU's rates.
So for the following slides, we're going to cover some of the major cost categories that fall under direct costs and most common policies that are associated with them. Again, your RA and grant officer will assist with ensuring any applicable rules have been met, but understanding the various levels of policy that apply to these costs may help prompt early attention as you consider them for your project. But before we start, are there any questions on F&A or the broader cost principles that we talked about? Okay, and great. Again, we'll have time at the end for questions. And then of course, this is recorded. We'll have our emails as well. So you can reach out to us if something comes to mind later on.
So personnel costs such as salary and wages and ERE, which are also known as fringe benefits, are perhaps some of the most common costs that are included in budgets. A mandatory 3% annual escalation on salary and ERE is an example of an institutional policy unless it's prohibited by the sponsor. Also for consideration are salary caps imposed by the sponsor. And examples of this may include like NIH's annual salary rate limitation, and NSF also has a limitation of 2 months of personal effort per year. And so ASU defines fringe benefits as direct costs. These are employee-related expenses, and they're ASU's cost for benefits provided to employees as part of their total compensation package at the university. These costs are a standard percent of salary and are charged in accordance with the federally negotiated rates in effect at the time salaries are incurred. These rates are included in our F&A rate agreement, and each year is escalated by 3%. There's also tuition remission, which is a cost that would be included in your budget if you happen to have a graduate research assistant, or GRA for short, in your budget. The tuition remission rate is determined by the graduate research associate's effort. The table in this slide, it shows that tuition remission rates for a GRA committing 100% effort during the academic year, which is defined as 20 hours a week for 9 months due to graduate college policy that states that GRA effort during the academic year can exceed 20 hours per week, and 100% summer effort, which is defined as 40 hours a week for 3 months. Tuition rates are escalated by 8%. So it's important to consider that there is a distinction between capital equipment and the materials and supplies costs that may be included in your budget. So for example, laptops that are $1,000 per unit would be considered a materials and supplies cost, not equipment. Capital equipment qualifies as such when there is a cost of at least $5,000. To be considered capital equipment, computer software, for example, must be at least $5 million. Fabricated equipment, which is constructed from individual parts by ASU and identifiable as a discrete item, could also be listed here. It's important to follow ASU travel policy when budgeting domestic travel expenses. Per diem and lodging rates vary depending on travel destination. Transportation costs may be calculated by estimating round-trip airfare, or if you're driving, by using the travel services website to determine the mileage reimbursement rate. An additional ASU fee is included in this category. There's also foreign travel, and this should be budgeted and justified separately. All ASU students and faculty, staff members, and accompanying students participating in university-related travel outside of the US and its territories must register in the International Travel Registry. A registry fee of $3 per day per traveler should be budgeted, with costs escalated in out years of the project. Short-term travel visa costs are allowable when critical and necessary to the project. Participant support can be budgeted for non-ASU attendees at a workshop, conference, or symposium funded by a sponsored project or in a short-term educational project or training activity. Participant support costs may consist of event registration, tuition fees, travel costs, training materials, participant supplies, and a stipend. Please note that you may see the term participant used for cost categories like human subjects, honoraria, or fellowships, but these costs are not the same as participant support costs.
And before Amber details this cost, our subrecipient or vendor costs, you want to engage your research administration early if you intend to subcontract or engage a vendor for services. These arrangements usually require additional outreach, possible system updates to the ERA record, and also compliance review. And if the designation of this service remains unclear after we talk about it, always feel free to inquire with your RA to review the work you intend to contract out, and they will let you know.
Thank you, Sarah. So the terms subrecipient, vendor, contractor, and consultant are sometimes mistakenly used interchangeably, but they're not the same, and each entity type as it relates to inclusion in your project has different implications. So for example, the role of the entity is the driving factor for determining payment method. Of note is the subrecipient, which you may see referred to as a subaward, subcontractor, or simply a sub. And while a sub performs a large portion of the technical effort of an award, a vendor supplies products and services, and consultants provide technical and temporary services. Consultants are experts outside the project, which a PI will hire to perform a discrete activity that doesn't involve designing or developing the research. There are also intra-university consultants, and they receive additional pay as a salary or wage. In addition to the numerical rate, base is also a component of F&A, which we're going to come back to. So for example, our federally negotiated rate has a base of MTDC, which is also referred to as modified total direct costs, meaning the F&A rate is applied to all of the direct costs except for a few categories like capital equipment, participant support, tuition remission, and so on. Because it can affect how F&A is calculated, incorrect identification of direct costs may lead to post-submission rebudgeting and potential underfunding.
Okay, so where to start? Once you're aware of the sponsor's expectations and possible limitations, you want to determine what will be required to execute the work. A good starting point is to identify who will be working on the project and for how long. For known individuals, which should be the case for any key personnel, you want to provide those names to your RA along with the amount of time that's going to be required for the project. For unknown individuals, indicate the positions that you desire for the project. So these would be graduate research assistants, postdoc possibly, or technical staff. What supplies or equipment will you require? If you have a link available to the supplier, please again, provide that to your RA. That may help them determine the costs more accurately. Will domestic or foreign travel be a part of the project? As previously mentioned, you'll want to identify the number of trips and travelers expected along with the estimated length of trip and destination if known. And if there are any remaining costs, you want to make sure to convey those. These can be animal care, if there's human subject support, participant support, or publication costs. Your RA will determine if there are any additional budgetary items that are specifically required or prohibited by the sponsor of the program that you're applying to.
We do have a question for you. Is there a standard percent by months for course buyouts, or is it set by unit?
It is set by unit, but conventionally it is 10%. I will say, and thank you for the question, we don't generally advise, you can, of course, per your unit, budget it in a way that is convenient or efficient for you. But as we provide the budget and the budget justification to the sponsor, we'll want to identify it either by percent or months. So in this case, it would be 0.9 months because they don't have any conception of what a buyout is. So we generally discourage identifying anything in terms of buyouts. But of course, if that is how your unit best manages those those commitments of effort, then that's fine. We just generally don't like to put it in the justification.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Sherry, if you have any more questions, again, feel free to email. So the budget information provided to your RA will ultimately be entered into the Electronic Research Administration System, or ERA. And you'll hear this often as you're talking with your RA. The system captures critical proposal data, automates institutional information and established rates, and is tied to the complete sponsored project cycle so that when your grant arrives, the resulting award account can be activated quickly. These next couple of slides are images of the ERA budget summary. The format that's submitted to the sponsor may end up looking different, but it will generally require the same level of information. Here you can see personnel estimates. Because ERA system loads the current salaries for the known individuals, ERE, and the required institutional escalations, an accurate total can be derived once the level of personnel effort is known, which is the amount of time that's dedicated to the project, the amount of paid time, I should say. Let's see. So ERA, will calculate the correct travel based on current per diem rates, estimate materials on a per unit cost, include any required tuition remission based on the GRA effort, and perhaps most importantly, it'll apply and calculate the correct F&A based on the research type, the location, and the sponsor policy. Note, though, that the resulting sum, of course, is the output of the information that you provide to the RA. So please be mindful to offer as much up-to-date information as possible. The information will ultimately need to be final at least 3 days prior to deadline in order to allow for a full proposal review. And as noted, what is sent to the sponsor may end up looking different, but it is dependent on the information that is provided and ultimately entered into ERA. So here we have examples of NIH budget, NSF budget, and a NASA budget. You also need to provide a written budget narrative to explain why the requested expenses are necessary for the project. Developing this with the RA early can affirm these costs in the budget, enable the RA to advise on revisions, and ensure descriptions are clear and appropriate. And finally, we'll reveal if any costs are prohibited under the governing policies. For each specific budget item, you'll want to detail the costs, explain why it's necessary, and indicate the timing of the expense. For instance, do you only need it in year 1, or is this a cost that will be recurring in each of the project years? Consider also that the budget represents to the sponsor what is possible based on the time and resources. So it's important to provide a narrative that clearly supports the scope of the proposed activity.
So a grant officer will review a proposal's budget and budget justification to ensure that all applicable federal government, sponsor, and institutional policies are met. Not meeting a sponsor request may lead to a request for revision post-proposal submission, or even a risk of proposal being deemed non-compliant. There are also institutional policies that, if incorrectly applied, may prompt disruptive budget adjustments at the time of award. It's important that budget and budget justifications are concise and clear. This is one of the many criteria your RA will work to ensure is met. The justification must be updated each time the budget is revised as well. A justification that includes costs that were deleted or conversely fails to explain costs that were added will be apparent to proposal reviewers and may result in a poor score or underfunding. So when a grant officer is reviewing a justification, they're also mindful of any page limits that may have been set by the sponsor. For example, NSF caps their budget justification to 5 pages.
Budget justification best practices are available to the RA and to the university at large if you're curious to look at them, and they ensure that each requested cost is adequately described and appropriately included per governing policy. This slide and the next few slides highlight from the best practices, and it's offered as an illustration of common or required language. It's the RA's responsibility to apply these practices, but it will provide insight to you on some of the questions that you may face when developing the justification.
So the budget justifications personnel section, which you see like the section right here on the screen, will identify the necessity of the positions of the project and effort, salary, and fringe amounts listed will align with the budget. Itemized travel amounts like airfare, lounging, per diem, transportation, and registration totals are commonly seen and requested by the sponsor in this section of the justification. Also, only travel for ASU personnel is included in this category per institutional policy. So a federal sponsor, for example, Department of Energy, may request that these categories in particular that you see on the screen include a basis of estimate in the budget justification. This basis may be a quote, catalog, or historical information. For the consultant cost, I usually see the number of hours and rate of service included. If there is consultant travel, it would be included in this category. Tuition tables are sometimes included in the tuition section of the budget justification. And in that case, the grant officer may check that the tuition rates listed are accurate and up to date. The subaward section is often condensed and is not the same necessarily as the justification submitted by the sub themselves to us. Here, we are just describing like who the sub is, what they're doing, and potentially a total. For the F&A section, if included during a grant officer's budget review, they'll check that the rate listed is accurate and that the F&A rate agreement approval date is correct.
Yes, and I will mention here, we did cover it briefly in our subrecipient slide, but generally, even though our budget will have a summary of the subrecipient costs, the expectation is that each subrecipient will have their own detailed budget to submit as well. All right, so once complete, it's a good idea to run the justification through the following checklist. Does the budget justification follow the same order as the budget? Does it give additional details to explain the costs included in the budget? Does it include only those items that are allowable, reasonable, and allocable? Is it easy to read? This usually requires shorter paragraphs, headings to separate different budget categories, etc. Is it concise? And finally, do the numbers in the budget justification match those that are in the budget?
Sarah, we did have another question come in. I think it was, what if there is a co-PI from another university? Are the budgets prepared separately from both universities?
Yes, that's correct. So if you have a co-PI from another university, that will generally require a subrecipient or a subgrant relationship. And in that case, you will name them as a key personnel within your proposal. You will require that they submit their own budget. Each sponsor has different policies to the level of detail required of those budgets, as do the programs within those sponsors. But generally, they will require, again, same level of detail where they're identifying how much effort they'll be providing, the cost of that effort, and any supplies or additional personnel that they will need. They will also provide a budget justification, again, generally is submitted as part of the application, but is dedicated to their specific costs. Great. So you may be called on to submit a budget that's based on project tasks and specific milestones. They may already be a part of your technical narrative, but the budget will then require that you assign costs to each of these tasks and milestones. So I'll show you an example in the next slide here, but this is just a brief description of what that task breakout may look like rather, and what it may require of you in terms of the narrative. As far as the budget, here's just a snippet. This is the personnel section of a task-based budget. You'll want to note that in addition to the task breakouts, you may also need to present estimates by month, by phase, or even by government fiscal year, which is likely going to be different than your project year and is different than ASU's fiscal year. In the case of this example, effort is provided as an hourly rate and may also require that the costs be loaded. And this involves including fringe benefits and F&A in the hourly or itemized costs, rather than explaining them as their own separate budget line. The RA will work on creating any necessary breakouts based on the budget information provided, but if you have a complex budget, because of the finer level of detail, it does benefit rather from identifying and finalizing these costs a little earlier.
So beyond common budget and budget justification, These documents can contain additional cost components as needed by the scope of the project or as requested by the sponsor or additional administrative considerations. So for instance, cost sharing is the portion of the total project costs not paid for by the sponsor, but rather is covered by ASU and or third parties. It shouldn't be offered unless required by the sponsor. It's a quantifiable expense and requires specific reporting throughout the award. There are also federally funded conferences, and federally funded conferences must spread information beyond ASU and are required for successful performance of the project. An intra-university conference is one that involves only ASU persons, and the cost of an intra-university event is unallowable, and it may include speaker fees, facility rental fees, local transportation, food, and other related costs. There are also human subjects, and human subjects provide data or participate in a survey or interview as part of a research project. In addition to related institutional review board, also referred to as IRB considerations, investigators are reminded that costs used as human subject incentives may not be budgeted in the participant support category.
There may also be fees required by the sponsor to submit a proposal or to receive funding. And you'll want to know that these are the responsibility of the proposed lead financial unit. Similarly, regular fees paid to an organization in exchange for an affiliation and the associated benefits, or otherwise known as membership dues generally, or assessment costs, those can come up. Those are also managed by the lead financial unit. International projects, as we briefly touched on, these take on additional budget elements. They can include taxes, provisions for currency fluctuations, visas, security, and gap insurance coverage. Just again, reach out to your RA early if the project includes any foreign performance sites. And that concludes our segment on the budget and budget justification. We're going to go ahead and try to apply the information in the following scenarios. We've got a couple of questions. Please feel free to chime in the chat if you've got an answer you'd like to share, and we'll talk about the results.
Cool. So think about this scenario. A project is on campus, organized research, and is subject to 57% F&A. However, the sponsor has a published policy which dictates a limitation of 27% F&A. Which rate is applied to the budget? And we'll give you a few seconds to think about it.
All right.
Sherry participates and says published policy rate with documentation.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yes.
Ding, 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 ding.
Exactly. Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, so in this case, you would apply the sponsor's 27% rate. Provided the rate is written into the program and sponsor guidelines, ASU will accept the rate and base indicated by the sponsor.
Yeah, and again, thank you, Sherry. Great catch. We only briefed that in the slides, so yeah, we snuck that one in there.
Thank you, Sherry.
All right, so you're thinking of proposing a project that will involve a couple of full-time graduate research assistants. Which of the following costs do you think should be included in the budget? As you can see, we've got personnel, ERE, or the fringe benefits, travel, participant stipend support, or tuition remission. And select all that you believe are applicable here.
Carrie Tepper guesses A, B, and E.
All right, yes, so you will definitely need personnel. This is the salary support, of course, to employ the graduate assistant. And if the individual is to be determined, your RA can help determine what the correct compensation will be based on your unit's established. You will also need the associated ERE, or the fringe benefits. These are required costs for all ASU employees and are estimated on the rate approved for that particular employment type. For graduate assistants, you will more than likely need tuition remission. So that's why it's in gray here. There are cases where this may be prohibited by the sponsor, or even arrangements where you can hire a graduate as an hourly student, which would then forego this particular benefit. But expect that it will be tied to any GRA employment to ensure that you don't under budget for your project. Your RA again will inform you of the current rate and then estimate on the proposed level of effort for that GRA. So thank you. And yes, Sherry, it can depend as well, but you'll definitely want to get that, the personnel and the benefits in there at the least. So thank you both for answering.
So now that you know everything about federal budgets, if you have time, I'd highly recommend checking out the upcoming proposal development workshops listed here and available also in Research Academy. Please also check out these resources that contain much of the information we've discussed today. Again, these slides will be available at funding.asu.edu if you need to refer to them in the future, any of the details that were covered.
I'll also take a second to note here, we've got a link to acronyms and glossaries. So if there was anything here that we did not clarify in terms of those acronyms, excuse me, please go ahead and check out that link. You'll see a whole host of what we use and shorten in our data.
It's very helpful.
Yes, yes, we still refer to it, so it's definitely a good resource. But thanks for joining us. We'll take then the next few minutes for any questions. And again, you'll see our emails here. So if there's something that comes to mind after the presentation, please feel free to reach out.
And we had a question, can we get a copy of today's presentation slides? Yes. The slides will be sent out afterwards along with the recording. Any other questions for Sarah and Amber? I want to give them a round of applause, but a few minutes in case anyone has questions. All right. Looks like you're getting lots of props in the chat box. Thank you so much, everybody. We will conclude today's budgeting presentation. As always, feel free to reach out to Sarah and Amber. They are awesome and experts in their fields, and we really appreciate them presenting today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.